Well, for more on trade and investment in Africa, I spoke with Aubrey Hruby, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center. And I began by asking her how past U.S. administrations have differed in their policy approaches compared to the Trump administration.
There's been quite a bit of continuity over the last administrations, in the last 2 decades, really, of U.S.-African trade. And the backbone of it is the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, as it's commonly known, which became law in about 2001. So all presidents have kind of used that as the backbone for U.S.-Africa trade. I would say the distinct difference is that the Trump administration has made a focus of their trade policy one of enforcement, enforcing all the different small rules that exist within AGOA, and reciprocity, meaning AGOA is traditionally a one-way street, giving African countries access to the U.S. market, but not necessarily providing for access for U.S. goods into African countries. So the Trump administration is putting a greater emphasis on the reciprocity of the agreement.
And how do you think that's going to change the dynamic of U.S.-Africa trade?
Well, AGOA is legislation that's been passed, and it stands through 2025. So AGOA itself won't change much during that period. But what you will see is increasing scrutiny on the different rules around AGOA. So, for example, Rwanda was recently kicked out of the program because of issues around their treatment of the secondhand clothing industry. So you will see a greater scrutiny on different domestic issues that within African countries that may impact their eligibility for AGOA.
So then post-2025, how do you see relations potentially changing, if at all?
Sure. So I do think that most people believe that the future of U.S.-African trade will be one of reciprocity. So there will be more of a mutuality of an agreement with whatever happens beyond AGOA. That could be free trade agreements, a series of them, or one with different regional entities. But these trends are not isolated to the U.S. European countries are also demanding greater reciprocity in their agreements with African countries. And this is all happening against the backdrop of African countries coming together under a free trade banner, which is the Continental Free Trade Agreement in Africa, which was signed in March of this year.
And how much progress have we seen on that free trade agreement?
Quite a bit. It doesn't come into effect in African markets until it's ratified by 22 countries, and ratification is underway. Last count, I believe there were 5 who had already ratified. So ratification is dependent on domestic processes in terms of parliamentary actions, and so it will take a while for it to come in, but it's the largest free trade movement since the founding of the WTO. So it is a generational project, but there has been early progress.
Now, there can certainly be some struggles when you're trying to get that many countries all on the same page when it comes to a free trade agreement. What do you see as the biggest potential challenges?
Well, I think implementation is the biggest challenge. Everyone can agree on paper that things are good, but then implementing them and keeping them implemented despite challenges domestically is where I think the art of this is. And you see that because, for example, there are existing trade agreements like COMCAST that have been in effect for a decade, and you see difficulties even enforcing those rules. Recently, there was a challenge between Uganda and Tanzania over sugar exports between the two, and those should be duty-free under COMCAST, but there was a new Tanzanian duty. So you do see challenges when it comes to implementing it.
Now, another big play when it comes to trade on the African continent, China, of course, and we saw that President Xi Jinping in his recent visit was very open to extending trade ties, cultural ties with the continent. How do you see that relationship developing?
Well, we're headed to a big milestone, which is next month is the FOCAC, which is the largest China and African summit that happens every 3 years. And at that, I expect a lot of new announcements, but it is true that China is Africa's largest trading partner, and the commercial ties between African countries and China have greatly deepened. But that is true for a lot of other countries. Turkey's more involved. There's been some movements this year around Russia. And so you see a lot of different regions looking to Africa's opportunity, and it gives African countries much greater choice in thinking about trading and investment partners.
And as you look at how trade within the African continent is shaping up, you have this young, fastest growing continent, In terms of the countries that are leading the way on the continent, what are the standouts for you?
So I think in terms of inter-regional trade and increasing inter-regional trade, the East African community, the 5 countries of the East African community have made by far the most progress. It also helps that they're fairly diversified economies, meaning they're not so dependent on, say, the export of oil. And therefore, they have more varied manufacturing goods to trade within the unit. So you do see that, for example, Kenya's largest trading partners are their neighbors, Uganda, Tanzania, for example, and likewise for Uganda and Tanzania. So I think they have the strongest inter-African trade story.